Hello and welcome to the Melbourne Writers Festival. My name's Rochelle Jackson. I'm a true crime author and journalist and I'm chairing this event. Crime writing has been described as a link with trying to preserve a sort of an order. American psychiatrist Carl A. Meninga delves further, explaining we need criminals to identify ourselves with, to secretly envy and to stoutly punish. They do for us the forbidden, illegal things we wish to do. And what does American crime fiction writer James Ellroy say about what he does? Look, he simply confesses, I don't know anybody in the underworld. I make this stuff up. I don't know any real criminals. Oh dear. Now, that statement by one of the masters beautifully illustrates, ladies and gentlemen, here today, exactly what crime fiction writing is all about. Crime fiction writing, as penned by our two authors here today, Michael Robotham and Tess Gerritsen, is all very clever. Oh yes, cunning, intricate plots and characters like your resident psychopath and the flawed but lovable detectives struggling with their inner lives while trying to solve the impossible crime which is baffling everyone while the body count keeps racking up. I've got to admit, after reading books from our authors here today, I started to get emotionally involved in their stories, their subplots, their subplots, and their crimes. But then I thought, hold on a moment, this isn't real. True crime is not like this. It's gritty, ugly, messy, and you know what? Sometimes downright stupid. Crimes don't get solved in a matter of days, and as much as the TV series Underbelly would like us to imagine, all gangster meetings are not held in strip clubs with half-naked women lolling around. Quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, crime fiction writing is fraudulent. Ladies and gentlemen, these authors, they've never been personally involved in solving murder cases, putting together police briefs, hunting down killers, bumping off dodgy individuals that got in the way, or interviewing victims' relatives. Look, even the crime fiction author, Jeffrey Deaver, says, he admits, I don't think I have what it takes to actually chase criminals through back alleys and wade through blood at crime scenes. Oh dear. James Ellroy, as I've already told you, has confessed, I just make this stuff up. And that's just what Michael Robotham and Tess Gerritsen do, ladies and gentlemen. They make stuff up. It's make-believe. Imaginary. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It's all done with smoke and mirrors and clever, clever writing. But just when I thought, yeah, I've got this all down, I've worked it out, I've got to tell you, I've got some very real reservations. I've got to confide in you that as a true crime author, I've been deeply disturbed by the level of accuracy and the inside knowledge of crimes and criminals in both of these authors' books. Oh yeah. How could Gerritsen, in her book, The Silent Girl, describe with such disturbing insight the martial arts evil master who lives in the shadows and appears when needed to murder with chilling accuracy using the sharpest of blades, if she'd never had that experience herself? And what about the old Robotham here? In his book, I'm using that term lightly, in his book The Wreckage, how does he articulate so beautifully the quirky mental gymnastics of a psychopath like the courier without being one himself? I'm sorry to report this, ladies and gentlemen, but my only conclusion today is that before us we have two major criminal offenders, quite possibly with a number of undiagnosed serious personality disorders and a long history of repeat offending between them. Oh yeah, don't be fooled. They may present as merely crime fiction authors, but I think we know what we're really dealing with, ladies and gentlemen. Legal criminals, legal criminals. People whose very vocation encourages them to devise plots, write about crooks, and describe with disturbing precision the very crimes that they commit. And ladies and gentlemen, don't just sit there passively. I'm going to ask you to take a long, hard look at yourselves in that same hall of mirrors and ask yourself, hold on, by being here today, does that actually make me an accomplice? Does it? Are you continuing to give these people imprimatur by buying their books, hearing them talk, and participating in these so-called writers' festivals? But before you start glimpsing nervously at each other and thinking of how you're going to describe that person in a photo fit, let me welcome to the couch our two authors, Michael Robotham and Tess Gerritsen. Now, after taking their medication, they're both going to speak before we throw the floor over to you for some questions. So let me introduce Michael Robotham. Before writing full-time, Michael was an investigative journalist in Britain, Australia and the US. He has been the ghost writer of 15 best-selling non-fiction titles, including prominent figures in the military, the arts, sport and science. He's one of Australia's most internationally successful writers and has been published in over 20 countries. And he's won or been shortlisted for some of the world's most prestigious crime writing awards. His book, The Suspect, won International Book of the Month. His book, Lost, won the 2005 Ned Kelly Awards for the Best Crime Novel, and also was shortlisted for the 2006 Barry Award. Michael's book, The Night Ferry, was shortlisted for the 2007 Ned Kellys and also shortlisted for the UK Crime Writers Association Steel Dagger. Shatter was the best crime novel in the 2008 Ned Kelly Awards and shortlisted for the Steel Dagger again in 2007. This book was also shortlisted in the ITV Thriller Award and for the South Africa's BOAC Prize. His book, Bleed For Me, was shortlisted for the Best Crime Novel in the Ned Kelly Awards 2010. Now, Michael lives with his wife and 3 daughters in Sydney. He said he has no hobbies, which actually drives his wife nuts. Michael once started a bushfire, ladies and gentlemen, that threatened his hometown when he was 6 years of age. He's held Hitler's skull in his hands, interviewed Jackie Collins in a bubble bath, and allegedly been in George Michael's shorts. Please bang your hands together and together again for Michael Robotham.
Thanks, Rochelle. And thank you for all coming. And I'm not a psychopath, I promise. It's funny, when I saw the topic for the session today, it was sort of about plotting the perfect crime. I thought they'd left a word off the end and it was supposed to be plotting the perfect crime novel, in which case I would have bought a ticket and sat in the front row with a notebook, hoping to pick up some tips. See, I've got a strange confession to make when it comes to plotting. I hate it. I detest it. It's the bit of the writing process that I dislike the most. It's like a trip to the dentist. It's like listening to my youngest daughter sing. It's like planning a wedding. I would say it's like natural childbirth, but I'd just get into huge amounts of trouble. No, I absolutely loathe it. What I love is the backstory. I love writing backstory. I love writing dialogue. I love writing the characters and the relationships. But the plotting bit, the twists and turns, I find incredibly difficult. It's like playing 3-dimensional chess, and you're also incredibly literate and you've seen and read so many crime novels and seen so many crime shows, and you know there are going to be twists and you can see them coming, and so you have to create extra twists and another twist you don't see, and it does my head in. But people often make the mistake of thinking that crime fiction is a plot-driven genre, and it's not. If I were to ask you now, each and every one of you, to name your favourite crime novel, and then say, what's the plot? Most of you won't remember it. It's the characters you remember. It's the characters that bring you back time and time again to particular writers, not the plots. It's the characters that really, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, you need to say that a crime novel is just about the plot is a bit like arguing that all literary fiction has no plot at all, which is just ridiculous, because the very best of literary fiction tells some wonderful stories. Now, when I look at, as I mentioned, when you think of, Peter Temple sadly isn't here today, and he couldn't be here today, but when you think of, Peter's remarkable books, you think of the characters. I mean, again, we've Broken Shore, which went on when it won the Gold Dagger, and Truth that won the Miles Franklin. Again, if you if you've read those books, to remember the plots, and you can't, but it's the characters, Steve Alani and Joe Cashin, are the people that you remember. It's the characters that count most in any work of fiction. It's their rivalries and their passions and their moral motivations and their flaws. They're what motivates the action and the reaction. It's the characters, it's strong characters that make for strong plots. Now, we're looking at supposedly the perfect crime today. And if you look at the definition of the perfect crime, it's a murder that is committed by someone. Where's it go? It's a perfect murder would be committed by a complete stranger who has never met the victim, has no criminal record, steals nothing, and tells no one. It's not a great deal for a crime writer to work with on that. It's no perfect crime. I mean, and to this whole idea of, as Rochelle sort of made out that, perhaps that Tess and I have sort of psychopathic tendencies or could be master criminals. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm a complete and utter coward. I'm my mother's son. My mother once screamed so loudly in a cinema they stopped the film and turned the lights up. I can't even steal a kiss, And to quote Woody Allen, I'm the sort of person that, if I played baseball, I'd steal second base, feel guilty, and go back. And so it's not about being able to commit these crimes ourselves, and this idea of the perfect crime. I mean, perfect crimes are incredibly boring. There are actually criminologists that will argue, they'll take it one step further, and they'll say that a perfect crime is so perfect that it's not detected at all. So if you know that the crime's been committed, by definition, it means it's no longer perfect. I know it sounds a bit very Rumsfeld-like here, known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns. You've got to get your head around it slightly. But the whole point is the interesting crimes are the imperfect ones, and they're the ones we deal with. Most murders are tragic, but most murders are mundane. I mean, two guys get into an argument in a bar, and one puts a glass in the other guy's face. It doesn't make for really interesting crime fiction. We're interested in murders that I guess. They're the ones that have big themes, or big motivations, or are the sort that where people are braver or the crimes are more terrifying, but they still have to relate. They still have to be close to home. Now, having argued that that perfect crimes are boring, I'm actually going to argue against it in the sense that The Wreckage, my latest novel, is actually about two perfect crimes. It's a bit different from most of my novels. This is a big global conspiracy thriller. And the idea came, I think Tess and I both have a situation where our ideas are all seeded in real life. I hate using the term inspired, because I don't want anyone to believe that a crime could inspire anyone. But in the case of The Wreckage, it was based on two stories that I read. The first was a brilliant Vanity Fair article published in 2007, written by James Steele and Donald Bartlett. And it was a piece that revealed that on the day that George Bush declared mission accomplished and stood on board the aircraft carrier in his flying gear, after Saddam Hussein had been toppled, a C-130 aircraft took off from outside Washington, Andrews Air Force Base, and it began the biggest airlift of currency in the history of the US Federal Reserve. 363 tons of money were flown into Iraq. $12 billion in total. $9 billion of that money has never been accounted for. It disappeared into the fog of war. That was the first article I wrote. I was fascinated by that. The second story was in December 2009 in the UK Observer, and it was the Executive Director of the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, Antonio Mario Costa, who basically estimated that at the height of the global financial crisis, Western banks were on the brink of collapse and so desperate for funds. The $352 billion of drug cartel money was laundered through Western banks, and that many of these institutions stayed afloat only because of this illegal money. I'll tackle that first of those stories first. $9 billion went missing. Some of that money went to contractors. I don't know, you've probably all heard of a company called Halliburton because Dick Cheney was a former on the board of directors. Halliburton was charging the US government for providing 42,000 meals a day in the green zone. It was only providing 14,000. It was actually charging for 8,000 security guards in the green zone, and there were only 600 warm bodies within it. That's where some of the money went. Other money ultimately went to fund the insurgency or whatever. But where I say it's a perfect crime is, as of 2 months ago, the Pentagon decided to close the books on this money and not search for it. It's basically decided it's not worth spending billions of dollars to chase billions of dollars. So in a sense, it's the perfect crime. You know, they have managed to get away with it. And similarly, with the money that was laundered through Western banks, again, these are institutions that were too big to fail. Nobody is chasing these banks and prosecuting these banks for laundering drug cartel money. Again, we're dealing with a perfect crime. It's interesting doing the research for the wreckage, and as I say, it's got multiple storylines, and one in Baghdad and one in London and another in Washington. I came across, some amazing stories, and I go, this is to do with an imperfect crime, but it's one of those strange stories you sort of come across, and it involves the biggest bank robbery in history. At 4 a.m. on March 18th, 2003, only hours before the US invasion began, or the air assault began, the sort of shock and awe campaign, Saddam Hussein's son, Qusay, and his personal assistant arrived at the Rafidian Bank in central Baghdad, carrying a handwritten note from Saddam Hussein. And they made a withdrawal of $920 million. It is regarded as the biggest bank robbery in history because it wasn't Saddam's money, it was the Iraqi people's money. They took 3 tractor trailers and 4 hours to actually load this money up, and they took it away. And it was all in aluminium, these beautiful aluminium cases, and each of these cases contained $4 million. Baghdad fell, and a week later, the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division are actually camped at Saddam Hussein's new presidential palace on the west side of the Tigris. And 2 enlisted men went searching for a chainsaw to cut down some trees that had fallen in the bombing. And they found a bricked-up gardener's cottage. And they broke through the walls, and inside they discovered 20 of these galvanized aluminium sort of cases. And they opened the first one, and it contained $4 million. They opened a second case and obviously realized what were in the other cases. They conducted a search, and by nightfall they had 164 of these boxes. Each of them stacked with $100 bills, $4 million in each case. Now, basically, they couldn't resist in the end. They figured 164 boxes, they're not going to miss 3. It's only $12 million after all. So they basically, 2 of the boxes they tried to sink in this ceremonial lake, and they figured they could sink it in the lake and they can come back later, not realizing the lake was only 2 feet deep. And when the sun came up, the sun hit the water, and these things lit up like underwater lights, and so they were found. The third one, they sort of stuffed in everything, from tank turrets to coolers to inside ready-to-eat bags of spaghetti. They were putting this, $600,000 were found inside a tree I mean, they were just bundling this cash together. Ultimately, all of it was recovered. I mean, they discovered it, and all of this money. Of that 981 million, only 600 million or just over it was ever recovered. The rest went to fund the insurgency or whatever. But there was one more little bizarre story to follow, because, I mean, these guys were court-martialed, for trying to steal this money. But basically what happened, an internet fraud letter went round, a bit like those Nigerian scams. And it began hitting inboxes around the globe, and it purported to be from one of the soldiers who claimed that he still had the 300 million, and that in fact if people he needed to get these funds out of Iraq, and if they lodged certain amounts of money in a bank account. So it actually became the subject of a big international fraud. Anyway, I'm going to get off now, but what I will tell you though is that this idea of perfect crimes and imperfect ones are the more interesting ones. We don't live in a perfect world and have perfect relationships or perfect families or perfect jobs, and we obviously don't have perfect writers, because that's why we have delete keys and erasers on the end of our pencils. And why should crime be any different? I mean, perfection is boring, and it's a really dangerous thing, because let's face it, because if we achieve perfection, what are we going to do for an encore? Thank you.
Michael Robotham, thank you. Tess Gerritsen is our next speaker. Now, Tess is an international best-selling crime fiction author. She's been published in 31 countries and sold some 15 million books. Tess left a successful practice as a physician to raise her children and concentrate on her writing. She actually began writing romance thriller novels first in 1986. She gained nationwide acclaim for her first novel of medical suspense, the New York Times bestseller Harvest. She's also the author of bestsellers Life Support, Bloodstream, Gravity, and The Surgeon. Tess has written 11 crime fiction titles. 9 of these books, including the book The Silent Girl, which I've just finished, are part of the series about Boston PD's detective Jane Rizzoli and her medical examiner colleague Maura Isles. The Rizzoli and Isles books are bestsellers and inspired an American TV show starring Angie Herman. The television series actually launched with some 8.6 million viewers. In fact, the TNT network has just announced the Rizzoli and Isles series is back for its 3rd season. She also co-wrote the screen, play and the story for a CBS telemovie called Adrift, which starred Kate Jackson. Now, Tess lives in Maine, USA, with her husband, and she has 2 sons. Her interests span far more than medical topics. As an anthropology student at Stanford University, she's catalogued centuries-old human remains. She enjoys gardening, plays the fiddle, and once played in Irish pubs for free Guinness. She's fascinated by ancient cultures, bizarre natural phenomena, and is crazy about archaeological ruins. Tess confesses she's going to travel just about anywhere to actually see a pile of rubble. Please clap your hands loudly and strongly for Tess Gerritsen. Thank you.
It's so good to see so many faces here. I would actually like to address several things that, first of all, Rochelle said about why do we write crime fiction? And you quoted 2 men, I think. It was James Elroy and that professor. And he said, we write crime fiction because we want to have the vicarious thrill of having plotted a perfect crime. That's asking a man. I think if you were to ask a woman, why do we write crime fiction? Why do we read crime fiction? I would say that we go for a different reason. We go for a much deeper, more emotional reason, not because we imagine ourselves as the criminal or imagine ourselves as the cop. I think we imagine ourselves as the victim. And I came to that conclusion years ago when I had a reader who stood up at a book signing, and I was there for a book that I had written called Gravity, which was a space station thriller that had no criminal involved. And the woman stood up and she said, I'm not interested in the space program. I would like you to write a book about something I am interested in. And I said, what's that? And she said, serial killers and twisted sex. So Just as an aside, I had to ask her, what do you do for a living? And she said, I teach. And I said, what do you teach? And she said, the 3rd grade. So I went home and I wondered, who else likes serial killer books? And I began to ask my readers, and almost all my female readers said, we love these books, but we only love them if the victims are women. I said, what if the victims are men? They said, we don't care about those. So women wanted to read books in which women are victims. Does that make us masochistic? Does that make us something? Is there something wrong with us? I confess that when I pick up a book with a serial killer involved, I am only interested if the victims are women. What is going on here? I began to wonder about this because it was bothering me, and then I thought, children's scary literature, kids read scary books in which the children are victims. So what we are doing, women and children in society at any rate, I think we feel vulnerable. I think we feel that we are potential prey at all times. When we read a book that's a crime novel, we don't identify with the heroine or the hero or the villain or the cop. What we are really identifying with is the victim, because that's what makes these books thrilling for us. It gives us a sense of being able to rehearse something terrible. It gives us a way to experience danger in a very safe manner. So if you were to ask a woman, why do I read crime novels? It's because we like to be able to identify with victims and to feel the thrill of possibly being in danger. Different mechanism involved. As far as that male professor, maybe men actually want to plot the perfect crime. I don't know. I find, in truth, that the crime is the least interesting part of a book when I write a book. The solution to the crime, yeah, intellectually it's interesting. Intellectually it's satisfying, but that's not why I read a book, and that's not why I write a book. Michael actually came up with the real reason, and that is characters. A couple of years ago, when I got called by the TV producer for Rizzoli and Isles, he said, and this is his opening line, I love your girls, and I think they belong on television. He did not talk about, I love your books, I love your plots, I love your crimes. He said, I love your girls. And that is why I write crime fiction. And that is really, when I'm going about plotting a story, it is what is happening to these people. It is the reason I have written a series. I never planned to write a series except for my girls keep insisting on it. And I want to go back and find out what's going on in their lives. So that is one very important element of crime fiction. And an important way that I plot is I want to find out what's going on in their lives. But we also don't talk very much about the ideas that come behind the stories. What is it that gets a plot going? As Michael said, plotting is very difficult, and I agree, it is incredibly difficult. I don't know how I do it. I don't outline ahead of time. I sit down and I just start writing. And what gets me going? What keeps me going? It is all about emotion. It's all about feeling the thrill, feeling the chill. As I like to say, it's that punch in the gut that gets me started. And what gets me started on a book often comes from real life. I am not making this stuff up. Or if I do make it up, it is based on something that has actually happened. So my first inkling of a plot usually comes with that punch in the gut. And I can tell you that there are many writers who don't understand this, many beginning authors who don't understand it. I teach a course for doctors who want to be novelists. I've been doing this for 11 years. Now, you would think that doctors would be good writers. We have material. We're exposed to the ups and downs of human behavior. We see tragedy. We deal with life and death situations, right? We have the material. But then I have doctors who are scientifically trained, very logical, come up to me and say, I have a great scary novel about managed care. Or, I have a hard-bitten thriller about pharmaceutical companies. You know, this is not what starts a book, and I would assume that it's not what would start a book for you or what would make you want to read this book. So I'm going to give you a little tour of examples where I knew a book was born, and all I need really is this one little thing, this one little push, this one concept to get a book going. And from that point on, I am just following my gut. Here's an example. I love to read tabloid magazines. I love to read newspapers. I read several newspapers a day. And there was an article in the Boston Globe, a very respectable newspaper in the United States. It was a very short article, and the story went like this. A young woman was found dead in her bathtub. There were empty pill bottles. The police came and decided this was just an accidental overdose. So they zipped her into a body bag, and they transported her to the morgue. And a couple of hours later, she woke up. Now, I was a little disturbed by this because we all have that fear of being mistaken for dead. So the first thing I did was I started to do a news search for how often does this happen in the United States. Now this is a good clue that this is going to be a book because I'm incredibly curious. I'm incredibly shocked by it. And I was even more shocked when I found out how often it happens. As a doctor, I understand that this can happen because doctors make mistakes. There was a boy whose death certificate had been signed before somebody noticed he was breathing. There was a young man who was hit by a car in Georgia, spent a night in the morgue refrigerator before somebody heard him moving. My literary agent, who grew up on a little island called Nantucket off Massachusetts, said, "On Nantucket, when I was growing up, it used to happen all the time." And I said, "Why?" And she said, they had a retirement home on Nantucket. The medical director was hard of hearing. So the nurses would call and say, "We think Mrs. Smith has passed away. Can you come and examine her?" And he would come, put his stethoscope on the chest, would not hear a thing, send her off to the morgue. One year, 3 people woke up. Nantucket used to call its morgue the House of Rejuvenation. The worst story I came across was a man who was lying on the autopsy table in New York City in the 1980s. The doctor was about to cut him open. I like that. And the man woke up. The doctor had a heart attack and died. So these are the things, you hear these stories, you think, oh my God, this is a great beginning to a story. What do I do with it? I don't care, I'm gonna begin it this way. So I began a book called Vanish, where my medical examiner, Dr. Maura Isles, is working late one night in the morgue. She hears movement, she goes into the cold room, she opens up a body bag, and there's a young woman lying there whose eyes pop open. Wouldn't that freak you out? Right. So what does she do? Of course, she sends the woman to the hospital, to the emergency room, and in the hospital, this dead woman who has come back to life grabs the security guard's gun. She shoots him, and she takes hostages. So it becomes a hostage crisis. Now, but this all began with a little article in the Boston Globe. What do you do with that kind of a story? How do you make that into a plot? That is where the art of storytelling comes in. The way I worked that into a plot was this woman wakes up, she goes into the hospital, she shoots a guard, she takes hostages, and among the hostages she takes is a very pregnant homicide detective who is there in labor, dressed in her little hospital gown with no ID, terrified that this crazy woman is going to figure out she's a cop and shoot her as well. So the story started with the Globe newspaper article, and it ended up in a hostage crisis. How do I plot that? I mean, where do I go from there? 10 different writers would take that opening scene and go in 10 different directions. What you do with it really defines what kind of a writer you are. You could turn that in a literary way. You can turn it into a thriller, which is what I did. And the way I plotted it was I didn't plot it. I just kept going. I just kept thinking every single scene, what's the worst that can happen now? And you would make it happen. You're always veering towards the most dramatic pathway, the pathway that leads to the most tension and the most conflict. This is why I don't plot out my books ahead of time, because if I do, then by the time I actually get around to writing the story, all the conflict and tension and excitement is gone. I like to be able to discover it while I'm writing the story. And it turned out that I was 2/3 of the way through that book, and I still had no idea why these things were happening. I don't need to explain these things. I just need to know that these bad things are happening. And very often, I won't know who did it until 3/4 of the way through the story. What happens for me is that I end up getting these horrific cases of writer's block, or I call them plot block. And how I approach that is that I will usually go on a drive. I'll get in the car and I will drive and I will drive. And I know a lot of writers say the same thing. They find that when they drive, it frees up their mind because they are doing something mechanical and it frees up the creative side. And I remember what happened in the middle of that desert in Texas where I was driving. Now, I had started that first draft with a man in the body bag. The man wakes up, the man takes hostages, and then it got boring for me. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know why he was doing these things. In the middle of the desert, I suddenly got this incredible revelation. I thought, you know, when men take hostages, it's not that interesting because they do that. You know, when hostage crises tend to be initiated by men. What if I made it a woman in that body bag? Women don't do these things. Oh, wow, now it's interesting. Now it's exciting. Now I want to know more. So I went home and I started just to write from that point on to the end as if it had always been a woman in the body bag. Suddenly I was excited again and I got all the way to the end and I figured out what was going on in the story. So that is a little bit about my process. It's seat of the pants, what we call. I'm a plunger, I'm not a planner, but it's worked for me for 23 books and I'm too old of a dog to change tricks now. So, and I like to tell writers that, you know, if you're told you must plot out your story ahead of time, and it doesn't work for you, then it's not the right way. The process is important. The process that is your individual process is what is important. Other times I remember that I got an immediate reaction to an idea when I knew this was going to be a plot, and this gets back to, are we actually plotting perfect crimes? Are we actually all that creative? I have an interest in anthropology. I was especially in Egyptology, and I had been corresponding with a mummy expert for some years after my university years. And he had an organization called the Mummy Consortium. What it does is it arranges for the CT scanning of every ancient Egyptian mummy in the United States. And they're scanned on the same hospital CT scanners that we are. So he called me up one day and said, we're about to scan a mummy down in New York. Do you want to come? I drove down to New York, and I helped them move the mummy from the local museum into the white van, and we drove it to the local hospital, and we put it on the patient gurney and wheeled it in through the lobby. You should have seen the people's faces as they saw this patient go through. And we put it on the scanner, incidentally, I heard that this scan had taken a long time to arrange. It had taken months to arrange. The reason for it was not the doctors who all wanted to do it. The reason was the hospital lawyer. In the United States, we have very strong confidentiality rules, and the hospital lawyer said, we cannot do this CT scan because we are unable to get the patient's consent. The museum came in and said, we're the parents, and signed the consent form. So we were watching the CT scan, and you could see this, the man had died 2,000 years before. And I remember watching this scan and thinking, what if we found something completely unexpected? What if we saw a bullet in the leg? It would change everything. Suddenly we're dealing with a modern murder victim who has been mummified in the ancient Egyptian technique. And it's possible to do that. You can make it look like an old mummy within a very short time, because essentially mummies are human jerky. That's all they are. And it doesn't take that long to make beef jerky, as we all know. So, and I thought, okay, modern murder victim, mummified to look like an ancient Egyptian mummy. Isn't that a cool, creative idea for a story? And I wrote a book called Keeping the Dead. And I thought this was the most creative crime plot I'd ever come up with, and nobody's ever done it, and boy, it's great to be a writer. And then I started talking to an Egyptologist who said, it may never have been done in fiction, but it has been done in real life. He had been called to India to consult on a mummy that a museum there was about to buy, but they were concerned that it didn't look quite right. So he flew out to India, looked at the mummy. First of all, he said it was a very bad mummification job. And second, it was a young woman, maybe 18 to 21, whose teeth had all been pulled. Ancient Egyptians would never have done that. So he called the police. He said, this is a modern murder victim. They pulled the teeth to hide the fact she had modern dental work. And it did end up being a murder investigation. It turned out she had been killed, and the killers decided they wanted to make money, so they mummified her and tried to sell her to the museum. The upshot of it is, no matter how gruesome the crime, no matter what the plot, no matter how twisted our stories seem, it has been done in real life. There is nothing new under the sun. And we are not all that gruesome after all. We don't commit the crimes. It turns out we are just mirroring what society is doing all around us. And I just want to finish up with a really quick little incident that happened to me a couple of years ago. I was called by a homicide detective who was a cold case detective in California. She started talking to me. Within a few moments, I realized she knew a lot about me. This was very scary. She knew where I'd lived in California. She knew who my husband was. She knew our movements. And finally, she said, "I'm calling because we've read one of your crime novels. We have been looking for a serial killer for 20 years, and we know that you know who he is." And what? I said. She'd even investigating my husband, thinking that he might have been the killer because we happened to be living in California during some of those killings. The reason she said this was because in your book, your character does from A to Z exactly what our real killer did. Every little detail. And she said, you must have spoken to him at a cocktail party. Maybe you interviewed him in prison. Tell us who he is so we can close this case. And I had to tell her I made it all up. We make stuff up, as James Ellroy says, and sometimes what we make up is so based in logic, it's so based in what a killer would do, that it turns out to be what killers do. So she was very disappointed, and she gave me her phone number and said, call me if actually you do remember somebody who might have told you these things. I think the upshot of this is that there are a couple of things you have to remember. There's nothing new under the sun, and what we do, if we are good novelists and if we are good actors, actually, I think we have to be good actors, and we can get into the minds of a criminal, we are going to come up with exactly the same logical sequence of actions that they will. So maybe it's a little bit of mind reading, but it doesn't mean we're twisted. We're just creative. Thank you.
Thanks, Tess. Now it's actually time for you to step up to the plate, ladies and gentlemen, and it's time for you to actually ask some questions. So if you've got a question, please put your hand up, and we've actually got some microphones. So we've got one down here. So with the microphone person, or we've actually got one up there as well. Why don't you go up there first? That might be easier. And there's another person down here too. Okay, so...
Really quick question. I'd like Michael to have a chance to respond to Tess's assertion about women and victims. I'd like to know if men ever see themselves as victims and enjoy reading that as well.
No, it's the opposite. I think most people who read my books will know most of the people that are in jeopardy tend to be women and children. I've actually been attacked for it. Actually, there are people that accuse me of only writing books in which women, it's why I have very strong female characters. But say, why your victim is always women. And I do try to point out that in real life, most of the victims tend to be, sadly, tend to be women. Although what I will comment on, something that Tess just said there, it's interesting when she said, you're right, there's nothing new under the sun. But when, recently, a few years ago, there's no way you could have written a novel about some guy that imprisoned his daughter in his basement and had 7 children by her. You just could not have got away with writing that in a crime novel because it would have been just so off the scale. And of course, the truth has proved, just how, the truth is so bizarre. Now, there are novels appearing with those sorts of plots.
Mm-hmm. I just want to make a comment about women victims. A lot of writers, I think, unfortunately, a lot of male writers get criticized for using so many female victims in their books. I'm not the last person to criticize them because I do that as well. But you will notice when you look at who is reading crime fiction, it's primarily female. I would say 75% are female, and that market wants female victims, and that's why you will very often see a female victim on the cover. It's because we want to be terrified, and that's what we identify with.
Question down here. Someone down here, yeah.
Hi, this question for both of you. It's about your research. Do you, I don't know, obviously you were a doctor, so you already got knowledge, but do you sit down with policemen and ask them how they do their job? So when you write it in your book, it's really close to reality. That's how you do your research?
Yes, in a sense, the former journalist in me means that I have to try as much as possible to have walked the streets and to have got all the information. I didn't go to Baghdad for the wreckage. It's my wife had forbidden me to go to 2 places, and one was Baghdad and the other's Chernobyl, which is for a future book. I have pointed out that we've had our children, so Chernobyl shouldn't really be an issue. But no, I normally take a very serious. I think there's a big mistake a lot of people can make with research is that you over-research. I tend to come up with a premise and let it unfold and do my research after the event, in a sense. I do just enough research to make sure that my plot works, there isn't some major hole in it, and then I go back and walk the streets, because otherwise you fall in love with your research, or your research tends to keep changing your idea for the plot and where it's going to go, and it begins to dominate.
Yeah, I would agree that you have to be careful not to let the research take over the project. What I do when I do research is I'm generally looking for, again, I'm looking for emotional details that really bother me. The most research-heavy book I ever did was that one called Gravity, about the space program, and I had to go to Johnson Space Center in Texas for a week, and then I went to Cape Canaveral for a week. What I'm doing there is not just getting the color of the carpet right or getting the color of the boosters right. I'm there listening to things that bother me. And for instance, when I was at Johnson, I remember talking to the public affairs officer and asking him, what are the chances of a disaster when you launch? And he said, we tell the public 1 in 1,000. And I said, you tell the public, what do you know? And he said, we know the calculations. It's 1 out of 50 launches, something terrible will happen. And this was before Columbia went down. Columbia went down, it's right on the dot, 1 out of 50 launches. So, that goes into the book, because I think it gives you a sense of, the flight crew that's there strapped in, they know their dangers, and that's terrifying to me, and I think that it's those details that are interesting to me, that they will be interesting to the audience.
And you will find people that will be willing to talk to you. A lot of people say, how do you find someone? People actually enjoy talking about their jobs, as long as you don't make the mistake. I did have one woman come to me and ask me this question about, I need policemen that will actually help me, and detectives and I can't get anyone to help me. And I said, why is that? She said, well, I'm doing this novel. And I said, what's it about? And they said, police corruption. Yeah, okay, so yeah, I can but in most cases, and I meet people and collect their numbers. I met someone in New Zealand a few months ago who was a scene of crime forensic officer, and I just make sure, quick, I want your email address, because there's some point you're going to get an email from me, because I'm going to want to ask you some questions.
Mm-hmm. Do people expect, or your readers expect, authenticity, despite the fact that you're writing crime fiction? Do you think that?
Oh, you make a mistake in there, and I mean we've all had the letters from. Particularly if you make a mistake when it comes to guns or ballistics, and you get the absolutely outraged emails of what sort of moron thinks a .22 can do that damage at that distance, and da-da-da-da-da, what sort of idiot are you? P.S. Should you ever need future ballistic advice, please feel free.
I've heard from that guy.
There's a gentleman up there, sir.
Yes, a question for both Terry and Michael. You made a point around the importance of the character over the plot, but I wanted to ask you if there wasn't an additional feature, and that is the place. And I think about, Inspector Montalbano or the streets of Edinburgh or so on. There's something about that element that, taken through a number of novels, that builds into something that is almost symbiotic with the character as well. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
There are some novels that are far more focused on place. For instance, what is it like to be shut up with 6 people in orbit and unable to escape? And then you get that sense of claustrophobia. There are only a couple of books where I felt that place was that important. And the other one was in a book I wrote called The Killing Place, which was set in a mountain storm in Wyoming. And my characters are trapped in a little valley with 12 identical houses, and meals are still on the table, but there are no residents. They've all vanished. So in that particular case, place becomes important. And when that happens, I have to make every effort to go there. I have to make every effort to make it accurate. For most crime novels, certainly with the Boston crime novels, yeah, you do have some local landmarks, but it is not as vital to the story as in that kind of a book.
I mean, I think it's. I'm a little different. I mean, I think it's enormously important. There are some. I mentioned Peter Temple earlier. I mean, Peter Temple, the way he writes. I mean, Melbourne in a book like Truth is another character. is so beautiful, the way he portrays the city. And I think, if you're reading sort of, Ian Rankin, the way he portrays Edinburgh, or James Lee Burke in New Orleans, or Michael Connelly in LA, they are like other characters in the novels and very important. That's of great beauty, I think, of much of modern crime fiction, is that, on any given week you can be in the wilds of Sweden with Henning Mankell, or in Venice with Donna Leone, or in Edinburgh with Ian Rankin, and these writers can take you to, not just tell a compelling story with compelling characters, but take you to a different place.
Got a question down here. Hold on just a moment and we'll get a microphone to you.
My question is to Tess. Have you become super vigilant about your own personal safety? And do you scare yourself? And another part is, do you think crime writing has created a stronger need in the community for governments to be strong on law and order decisions?
First, completely forgotten the first part. No, I don't worry about my personal safety. Luckily, I live in a small town in Maine where there aren't issues. And I remember that my English publisher showed up one day to come to our house, and she'd lost my address, and she asked a local policeman, and he refused to tell her. So I know that, when you live in a small town, people do look out for you. I have not really been worried about personal safety, although, the books we write tend to attract odd people. I'd sometimes get really odd emails.
No.
The third question, which is, I don't think crime writing has any effect on government. I don't think they care what we do. I think they think we're just entertainment. And I forgot what the second question was.
I think that was the second
it's
question.
interesting. Sorry, I know. In reality, I know we write about scary things and scary crimes at times, but in reality, we live in a wonderful country, and the murder rate or the rate of child assaults and whatnot is no greater now than it was 30 years ago per head of population. So I think the 24-hour news cycle has made us more concerned and made us more paranoid about this safety issue. But in reality, the world hasn't become a scarier place. The roads are busier, so you've got to worry about your kids on the roads. But other than that, I think it's the news cycle and our perceptions rather than real life.
Okay, is there anyone else? Question down here, right in the front.
In the course that I'm doing, my teachers say that we should be writing every day. I was just wondering if both of you have a set time of the day that you like to write, and do you write every day?
You?
I try to write every day, more and more, and I'm sure Tess a bit like that. You're very fortunate when you reach a certain level of success and you are asked to tour and you do a lot of touring. You have to learn. In the past, I could never write on the road when I was travelling, and I'm having to learn to be a bit more diligent at writing every day. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to be writing anything other than a long email to a friend, but as long as you're writing something, I think it helps.
I write as often as I can. I think what we're dealing with are deadlines. In my contracts, they specify a date of delivery, and I have to stick to that date. So sometimes I will start off being quite leisurely, early on in the year, and then I get closer to my deadline, and then I'm there every day, and my husband doesn't see me. So for me, it's very much deadline oriented.
We've got a question down here in the front.
Just elaborating a bit further on that point you made, does that deadline issue affect your creativity, do you think? You having to be creative to a deadline?
Does that affect our... to some extent, I think that it just speeds things up a little bit. It's like drinking 5 cups of coffee. The creativity is always there. The discipline is what is lacking.
Yeah.
And I think that it just makes you far more disciplined. I know that if I were disciplined as disciplined as I am towards the end of deadline, every day of the year, I could be writing 3 books a year instead. But there's so much that has to do with mental health, interest, curiosity, and we don't talk about this enough. One major thing that I think unites most writers is that we are a very curious bunch. Yeah. We have an interest. We want to know a lot of things. I love to travel, and that curiosity sometimes pulls me into different directions that I wish I could be pursuing, except I have a deadline.
It's interesting. Time is so important. People don't realise the importance of time. So often first novels are years in the making. That you toss them around, kick them around the bottom drawer, you know, and you imagine that if you get a publishing deal and you get that published and you get told, you know, that you have to write the next one in a year, that, oh, that's going to be easy because suddenly you've been vindicated and justified in your book. But in fact, I think it's what sorts out in terms of, you know, the men from the boys, the women from the girls, is the ability to sit down and to consistently write. I mean, look, Tess, 23 books, consistently write quality work and do it year after year after year. And it's, you don't have that great sort of benefit of years of kicking around ideas. You have to speed up the process, as Tess said.
That's why it's the sophomore book very often, you know, is a little bit of a dip in quality because now you're faced with that second book syndrome.
Yeah. It's almost like once you get the second book done, you sort of think you can relax because you've proved you can do it more than once. You can stuff up your third book.
Can you pass the microphone to that gentleman?
As you're writing, who do you test your ideas out on? And how do you deal with feedback?
It's one of the things, my wife always thinks I was a much more interesting person when I was ghostwriting because, you know, I'd be hanging out with sort of famous people and I, you know, had loads of dinner party, you know, gossip and other things to talk about. Whereas, you know, on any given week, when someone says, how's your week been? You think, oh, I've managed to do 4,000 words, you know. It's, and you don't really want to be telling people the intricacies of the plot or whatnot because you don't want to give things away. And, you know, I'll go for long walks on the beach with my wife, and it'll be really interesting because I'll be just saying, you know, I need your advice on this, and I'll be throwing things at her and just talking constantly, and she won't say a word. Occasionally she'll go, yeah, okay, fine. And somewhere in the process of that walk, I'll have answered my question, and at the end of it, I'll be going, gee, thanks so much for talking that through. But, yeah.
I don't bounce my ideas off anybody. No, I don't let anybody see it until I've gone probably 7 drafts, and I feel it's ready to go off to my agent or editor. Then my husband gets a look at it. And I use him primarily for spell check.
Have we got any other questions? Yeah, okay. Can you pass that microphone along? Thank you.
Tess, if you get so busy when you're approaching your deadlines and you don't see your husband, are you sure he's not a serial killer?
I know he's not, because we were just talking about how, you know, men, especially intellectual men, are known as are metrosexuals in the U.S. I just can't imagine him ever picking up a knife and doing anything but maybe carving a turkey very badly.
I always remember Rochelle mentioning earlier about this idea of whether we're psychopaths. I was very fortunate to do 2 books with a man called Paul Britton, who's a very amazing forensic psychologist who worked on cases like Fred and Rosemary West and Jamie Bolger and things like that. But when I worked with him at one point doing the second book, I always wondered, I don't know if you've read Red Dragon, but the Will Graham character in that, the reason he's so brilliant at profiling serial killers is he's so close to being psychopath himself that he has this sort of knowledge. And I often wondered with Paul Britton whether, you know, when I used to work with this guy, and at one point I went to work with him, and I got to his house, and for 2 or 3 days there I didn't see his wife and kids at all. and he's a very intimidating guy, this guy, because he can just read you in a flash. But I said, so, you know, Paul, what have you done with your wife and kids? Have you buried them in the garden? And he just looked at me and said, why do you ask?
Okay, look, I'd like you to thank our authors here today for coming along, for their participation. You can meet Michael and Tess downstairs and buy a copy of their book downstairs in the Dimmicks bookshop in the atrium. Please, thank you very much for coming along on your Saturday mornings, and we'll see you around. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
That was
Tess.
fun.
That was fun.